Imagine walking through a parking lot and spotting a $20 bill on the ground. No owner in sight, no suspicious fishing line attached to it, no YouTuber crouched behind a Honda Civic waiting to film "Stranger Finds Money." What happens next? Just $20 sitting there. You pick it up, and for maybe 7 glorious seconds, you're the chosen one. The universe has personally funded your lunch. Somewhere in the cosmic accounting department, an angel just approved 1 medium burrito, possibly with guacamole. Later that same day, you reach into your pocket and the bill is gone. Your $20 has escaped. Probably not a neutral feeling. Mathematically, the day landed exactly where it started. 0 surprise dollars, then 20 found, then 20 lost. Net change of 0. Emotionally, though, this doesn't feel like a completed circle at all. It feels like the universe handed you a tiny trophy, waited until you got attached to it, and snatched it back while holding aggressive eye contact. Finding the money felt pleasant. Losing it feels personal. Psychologists call this pattern loss-aversion, but the name hides the important part of the mechanism. Your brain probably doesn't care about the $20 itself nearly as much as it cares about a completely imaginary line, and modern life has gotten extremely good at moving that line without asking permission. Here's the direct answer. The moment you considered the money yours, 0 stopped being your reference point. You weren't comparing $20 to the morning when you had nothing anymore. You were comparing having $20 to having just lost it. The gain quietly moved the floor underneath you. To see how that works, picture something slightly more scientific and a lot less fun. A coin flip where heads gets you $20 and tails costs you $20. Would you take it? Many people refuse, which seems sensible until you notice the average outcome is exactly 0, since the possible gain and loss are equal. If $20 produced the same pleasure going up as pain going down, the gamble should feel emotionally balanced. It often doesn't. Raise the potential reward and something shifts. You might still turn down a chance to win 20 or lose 20, but win 30 against a loss of 20, and now you're considering it. Win 40 against that same $20 loss, and the prehistoric accountant behind your forehead starts dragging the proposal toward management for approval. This pattern helped inspire one of the most influential ideas in behavioral economics. In 1979, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published prospect theory, a model built to describe how people actually make decisions under risk, not how a perfectly rational spreadsheet creature is supposed to make them. Traditional economic models treated value in a fairly clean way. More wealth is good, less wealth is bad. Add $20 and value rises, remove $20 and value falls. Your actual brain never got that memo. Kahneman and Tversky argued that people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point instead, and that point might be what you currently own, what you expected to own, what you believe you deserve, or what you'd emotionally started spending 3 minutes ago. Outcomes above that line register as gains, outcomes below it register as losses, and in a lot of decisions, the slope on the loss side is steeper. That's the formal heart of loss aversion. An equivalent loss can carry more decision weight than a gain. You've probably heard this turned into a catchy factoid, something like, losses hurt exactly twice as much as gains feel good. Catchy, yes, also too clean. A major 2024 meta-analysis led by Alexander Brown examined 607 estimates pulled from 150 articles across economics, psychology, neuroscience, and other fields, landing on an average loss aversion coefficient of 1.955, remarkably close to 2 case closed apparently. Someone go carve that number into the psychology mountain. Except another 2024 meta-analysis, this one led by Walasek, focused specifically on studies that estimated loss aversion from individual choices between risky mixed gambles, and it produced a much smaller average of 1.31. The authors also found surprisingly few usable datasets and warned that a lot of the underlying data was too weak to pin the model down precisely. 1 scientific literature, 2 meta-analyses, 2 very different-looking answers. That doesn't mean one team discovered loss aversion while the other misplaced it behind the laboratory sofa. The analyses asked related but different questions, pulled in different evidence, and used different modeling requirements. Together they show why exactly twice is a wrong lesson to take from any of this. 2 might be a useful average under certain definitions and study designs, but it isn't a universal biological constant, and it certainly isn't the emotional speed of light. The ratio shifts across people, tasks, stakes, experience, models, and whichever reference point happens to be active. What matters is the general idea that gains and losses are frequently asymmetric, that your mental graph has a kink in it. Where researchers argue is over the precise angle of that kink, not over whether it exists. And that kink shows up in places far stranger than a coin toss. In a famous series of experiments, Kahneman, Knetsch, and Richard Thaler randomly handed some participants ordinary coffee mugs, then invited the new owners to sell while other participants got the chance to buy. Standard theory predicted plenty of trading, since a mug should carry roughly the same value whether you happen to own it or you're just looking at it. Ownership changed the math anyway. Sellers generally demanded more to give up their mugs than buyers were willing to pay to get one, and fewer mugs changed hands than the traditional model predicted, an effect that held up across repeated rounds of the researchers' market. Their results became a classic demonstration of the endowment effect. Before ownership, a mug is ceramic clutter. After ownership, it's my ceramic clutter. A buyer asks how much pleasure this object would add. An owner effectively asks how much you'd have to pay them to tolerate its removal. Same mug, different side of the reference point, and that's the whole trick. None of this means loss aversion is the only explanation available for every endowment effect experiment out there. Transaction costs, misunderstanding, plain attachment, market experience, and reluctance to act can all play a role, along with the method used to set prices. But the bigger principle holds up. Possession can change the psychological meaning of an outcome, and expectation does the exact same thing. Say your employer unexpectedly hands you a $500 bonus. Great, you feel richer. Now say your employer tells you in January that you'll get a $500 bonus in June. By February, that money already has furniture. By March, it's booked a vacation. By April, it's wearing sunglasses beside a hotel pool. Then June arrives and the company cancels the bonus. Technically, money you never possessed hasn't been removed from your bank account. Your reference point had already moved though, and your brain had counted that expected $500 as part of the future it owned, which means the cancellation lands not as the absence of a gain but as an actual loss. This is how expectations can wound you with objects that never existed in the first place. Your brain becomes the legal owner of an imaginary future, then sues reality when it fails to deliver. Researchers have gone looking for the neural processes behind loss-averse decisions too. In a 2007 experiment, Sabrina Tom, Craig Fox, Christopher Trepel, and Russell Poldrack put people in a brain scanner while they weighed 50-50 monetary gambles. As potential gains grew, activity climbed across several reward-sensitive regions, and as potential losses grew, activity dropped in many of those same regions. People whose neural responses showed more asymmetry also tended to show more loss aversion in their actual choices. The results suggested loss aversion doesn't need some tiny separate fear center screaming about money. Gains and losses can be represented asymmetrically inside overlapping valuation systems, and while the study didn't prove where loss aversion comes from, it showed the behavioral pattern has measurable neural fingerprints. Later work complicated the picture, because brain research loves doing that right after someone produces a satisfying explanation. Amygdala activity, arousal, attention, context, and delivered emotion regulation have all entered the conversation since. In research led by Sokol-Hessner, participants showed more physiological arousal per dollar of loss than per dollar of gain, but asking them to take a broader, portfolio-like perspective reduced both the arousal gap and the loss-averse choices themselves. The response, in other words, isn't necessarily some fixed alarm bolted permanently into the skull. A shift in mental framing can soften it, and that matters because it tells us we're not always dealing with an unstoppable reflex. Back to the $20 bill. Losing it doesn't hurt more because the number -20 carries some extra dose of emotional poison. It hurts because the moment you considered that money yours, zero stopped being your reference point. And you didn't just lose a piece of paper. You fell from the world where you had $20 into the world where you didn't. And human brains appear to care a great deal about downward movement. That explains why the first raise at a new job feels incredible, while the same salary a year later feels like a Tuesday. The money didn't shrink, the reference point rose. It explains why a discount can create delight exactly once and irritation forever after. Give someone free delivery for 3 months, then start charging $5, and you haven't simply offered a service at a new price. You've taken away a benefit their brain already moved into the ancestral cave and labeled ours. It also explains why cancel buttons behave like emotional hostage negotiations. You're about to lose unlimited access. Your saved projects will disappear. Your streak will end. Your lonely digital owl will be disappointed in you. A company could just describe cancellation as saving $10 a month. Instead, it shows you a pile of things being taken away, and the arithmetic is identical even though the psychological direction is not. Loss framing helps explain why investors hold on to declining assets longer than good judgment would recommend too. Selling does something emotionally unpleasant. It turns a paper loss into a completed one. As long as the stock sits in the account, there's still a small cave painting where it recovers, your judgment gets vindicated, and everyone who doubted Moonferret coin has to apologize publicly. Selling destroys that future outright. Economist Terence Odean analyzed trading records from 10,000 brokerage accounts and found investors showed a strong preference for realizing winners rather than losers, tending to sell assets that had risen while continuing to hold assets that had fallen, even after he ruled out several practical explanations for the pattern. This became influential evidence for what's known as the disposition effect. Here's an important precision upgrade though. PropSec theory contains more than loss aversion alone. It also describes diminishing sensitivity, the idea that each additional move away from the reference point changes subjective value by less than the previous move did. Some financial models attribute the disposition effect more directly to that shifting sensitivity and to a willingness to gamble once already below the reference point, rather than to losses simply carrying extra emotional weight. Loss aversion contributes to the story without owning it single-handedly, and investors hold on to losers for plenty of other reasons too. Taxes, beliefs about prices reversing, pride, limited attention, or an unwillingness to admit that buying Moonferret coin wasn't technically retirement planning. The same distinction shows up in relationships, careers, and personal projects. People often say, "I've already put 3 years into this," which sounds like a reason to keep going. Those 3 years are gone either way, whether you continue or stop, and the actual question worth asking is what the next year is likely to produce. Leaving can still feel like losing the time, the identity, and the imagined future attached to the project, while continuing lets the mind preserve the possibility that the investment will eventually get justified. This overlaps with the sunk cost effect, related to loss aversion but not identical to it. The mind isn't simply afraid of losing more here, it's resisting the fact that an earlier cost has already become unrecoverable, so it keeps feeding the dead project. Not because the project is alive, necessarily, but because admitting it's dead would require paperwork. At this point, loss aversion starts sounding like a master key for every irrational thing humans do. Someone keeps an old jacket, loss aversion. Someone refuses to sell a stock, loss aversion. Someone screams because a seagull stole one French fry, loss aversion. A theory that explains everything after the fact, though, risks explaining nothing very precisely. Psychologists David Gall and Derek Rucker have argued the evidence doesn't justify treating losses as universally more powerful than gains, and in their critical review, they questioned whether several famous findings uniquely demonstrate loss aversion, or might instead reflect inertia, attention, or plain context. Newer evidence makes the individual differences even harder to wave away. Stephanie Wang and Colin Camerer studied loss attitudes through 3 incentivized surveys built to represent the U.S. population, and given the experts in the earlier student-heavy research, you'd expect most participants to come out loss-averse. Instead, roughly half turned out loss-tolerant, willing to accept some negative expected value gambles that carried a possible loss. Even stranger, loss aversion showed up more among people with higher measured cognitive ability, while loss-tolerant participants were more likely to report recent gambling, hold a bigger share of their assets in stocks, and have gone through a recent financial shock. The study couldn't tell whether loss tolerance helped create those experiences or the experiences helped create the loss tolerance, so causation is still out in the parking lot searching for its keys. What the finding destroys, though, is the idea of one permanent human loss setting. Different people aren't just showing different amounts of the same response. Some of them are placing more weight on the possible gain entirely. One more crucial distinction, choosing more carefully to avoid a loss, doesn't necessarily prove that experiencing the loss will feel dramatically worse than experiencing the gain feels good. Anticipated emotion, attention, decision weight, physiological arousal, and actual happiness are related, but they're not interchangeable. Your brain might give losses more influence at the moment of choosing simply because losses demand attention, threaten a goal, or signal that something went wrong. And none of that requires the lived misery afterward to be exactly twice the lived pleasure of a gain. So the honest version is less meme-friendly and more interesting. Loss aversion is a real, useful pattern across plenty of kinds of choice, especially when a clear reference point separates gains from losses. But its measured size depends on who's choosing, what they're choosing, how the choice gets modeled, and which reference point happens to be active. It isn't a universal law stating that every bad event carries twice the emotional force of an equally sized good one. Context builds the scale, ownership moves the zero, expectation redraws the boundary, and experience trains the response over time. Professional traders, for instance, learn to think in portfolios and repeated outcomes, rather than treating every isolated decline as a fresh wound. Someone looking at one gamble thinks, I could lose $20. Someone looking at 1,000 similar gambles thinks, what does this strategy produce across the whole series? The first mind sees a falling spear. The second sees statistics, and neither perspective makes a person immune to emotion. But the second one can stop a single vivid loss from hijacking the entire decision. Now for the evolutionary question. Why would minds work this way at all? There's an appealing answer here, but it needs an honest label. We don't have a fossilized decision graph from some Paleolithic brain sitting in a museum. And we can't demonstrate that natural selection installed modern monetary loss-aversion as a dedicated adaptation. Money, stock portfolios, subscription trials, and coffee mug markets are all extremely recent inventions, so evolutionary explanations here are plausible frameworks, not solved origin stories. Still, the asymmetry makes functional sense in environments where resources affected survival non-linearly. Picture having enough food to make it through 3 dangerous winter days. Finding one extra day of food is useful. Losing one of the 3 days you already have could be catastrophic. The gain and the loss are physically equal 1 day of calories either way, but their consequences are not. Moving from 3 days to 4 gives you a buffer, while moving from 3 days to 2 can push you toward a threshold where weakness makes hunting harder, illness more dangerous, and recovery less likely. Near the edge of survival, subtraction can matter more than addition, and the same logic likely applied to shelter, allies, social standing, territory, tools, or access to dependable food. An organism that casually surrendered secured resources every time an equally sized opportunity showed up would occasionally make a beautifully balanced decision during its brief career as lunch. A bias toward protecting what's already secured probably served a purpose under some ancestral conditions. And notice the phrase, under some conditions. If refusing every risk also meant missing food, mates, territory, or an escape route, extreme loss aversion would carry its own real costs, and our ancestors didn't survive by clinging to one berry until retirement. Risk sensitivity should shift with need, opportunity, experience, and environmental stability, and that flexibility is exactly what the modern evidence points to. The mind isn't a machine with one permanent loss setting. It's a system constantly trying to figure out where safe enough ends. And this is where evolutionary mismatch enters the story. Mismatch happens when a trader decision rule shaped under one set of conditions ends up operating inside a radically different environment. A protective sensitivity to losing food, shelter, tools, or social support isn't ridiculous when replacement is uncertain and crossing a survival threshold can be fatal. But today, that same reference-dependent machinery runs inside an environment full of companies whose job is manufacturing ownership and expectation faster than you can examine either one. A free trial becomes your normal service. A temporary perk becomes part of your salary. A social media streak becomes property. A speculative price becomes money you believe you already possess. A delivery app shows you a discount, crosses it out, and lets your brain grieve the removal of a price you never actually paid in the first place. You're carrying a nervous system built to protect secured resources through a shopping mall built entirely out of imaginary reference points. The mismatch isn't simply that ancient brains dislike losing. It's that modern systems can make almost anything feel already owned. A number on a screen rises, and within seconds your mind furnishes the cave. Then the number falls back to where it started, and alarms fire as though a rival clan just stole half the mammoth. The mammoth was never there. It was a green line on an app. But the reference point felt real enough to your valuation system regardless. This is why just be rational counts as weak advice. The response isn't caused by stupidity. It comes from a brain doing exactly what brains are built to do. Compare the present against a baseline, notice deterioration, and defend whatever has entered the model of mind. The useful move isn't eliminating that machinery, since you probably couldn't anyway, and in a lot of situations you wouldn't even want to. The useful move is inspecting the reference point before obeying the feeling. When a loss feels unbearable, ask yourself unbearable relative to what? What you had yesterday, what you expected to receive, the highest number you briefly glimpsed, a price set by someone trying to sell you something, a future you imagined so vividly your brain started treating it as property. Then widen the frame. Instead of asking whether this one decision might produce a loss, ask what repeated decisions of this kind produce over time. Instead of asking what you paid for an investment, ask what you'd choose today if you held the same value in cash. Instead of asking how much time you've already given a project, ask whether the next month deserves another month of your life. Instead of asking what disappears when you cancel a subscription, ask what you gain by getting your money and attention back. None of this makes losses pleasant. Losing $20 is still annoying, and $20 still buys real things, including roughly $4 worth of movie snacks. But understanding the mechanism separates the signal from the siren. Sometimes the pain is warning you about a real deterioration. Sometimes the just defending a reference point that an advertisement, an expectation, a market peak, or an earlier version of you quietly installed without asking. You're not broken because losing $20 stings more than finding $20 delights you. Your brain isn't running pure arithmetic. It's guarding a border, and the trouble is that the border keeps moving. That $20 bill in the parking lot crossed it the moment your fingers closed around it, stopped being money found, and became money possessed. When it vanished, you didn't return peacefully to the morning. You experienced removal. So somewhere beneath a Honda Civic, the universe might still be laughing at you, but now you know the real trick. It was never hidden in the $20. It was hidden in the word mine. Which would bother you more, losing $20 from your pocket or discovering you missed a chance to win $20? Tell me in the comments and defend your answer, because people are going to disagree. If you want to keep understanding why your brain and body do things that make no sense in the modern world, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming.